Hello. This week we are going to be doing something new in which our Tuesday night evening class was recorded and we are presenting it here to you on our YouTube channel for those who are not able to be there in person. This is an experiment and we would like to hear your feedback. Was this a useful thing where we record the class and so that you can watch it later? We are trying to find new ways of reaching you with the message and ministry of Central Lutheran Church. So, today we start something new, which we'll do for, if all goes well, about 5 sessions, which is on, we'll look at it here, but one of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's last things he wrote was a letter. And it doesn't have a title because it's just a letter to Ebkhard Bethge. And it says, and in it famously it says, "Who is Jesus Christ for us today?" And that's going to be the theme of what we're going to look at. And we're going to look a little bit at this in a variety of ways. But tonight, to begin, my question for you is to start with is just, what do you know about Dietrich Bonhoeffer?
He tried to kill Hitler.
Okay, he was involved in the conspiracy to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Yeah, and they were all caught, and he, amongst all the other conspirators, was executed in 1945. Yeah.
Just a few days before the war
Yeah.
ended.
Yeah. With many other political prisoners.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sort of leader of the confessing church?
Yeah, so he was part of the confessing church. He wasn't quite a leader. He was becoming that later. What you'll discover is in 1946, the picture of him as a leader becomes quite profound, meaning who were the leaders of not the confessing church, but just the Lutheran Church in Germany. There's a particular person by the name of Theophil Wurm, who was not part of the confessing church. And the challenge with the confessing church is you would have thought, well, here is where your leadership is going to be. But they were almost all incredibly young, inexperienced pastors. They didn't find a lot of bishops among them. And so the memory of Bonhoeffer in Germany at that time was essential for them, because here was the image of, well, there was this group among us. And thankfully to them, Bonhoeffer was no longer alive to say anything, because I don't think he would have gone along with what their picture was. But the German church reconstruction is really when Bonhoeffer becomes famous, after he dies.
I don't know what confessing Lutheran means.
Oh, so the confessing church, this was, so in Germany, at the time of World War II, there were 28 Lutheran denominations. There's roughly that many now. Adolf Hitler wanted there to be one. And so he started to organize all of them with specific aspects of what they were going to do in this. It was called the Reich Church, Reichskirche, what they were going to be doing. It's why, by the way, in American churches, by the way, you'll see the United States flag and so forth. You'll never see that in a German church now, because that was part of the Reich Church, was that they had. But the confessing church was a group that started, and Bonhoeffer wasn't there. He was in London at the time. There was a meeting in a place in Barmen where they made a declaration, and it was that they argued for the independence of the church from the government, which might be surprising given that it was a state church. But, and the confessing church did remain a part of the state church. Their salaries were still paid by the government. It wasn't exactly the French Resistance, which some people think of it as that. But what it was that at Barmen they didn't, but later the big critical turning point is they would not include the Arian paragraph, that all leaders of the church had to be of Arian descent or whatever it was and so they were the rebellious group. Bonhoeffer ends up leading their seminary in Finkenwalde. It's a tiny little thing. He was in his 20s at the time, and so he ends up being the leader of their seminary to train new pastors. So it was seen as the Lutheran group who opposed Hitler. That whereas most of the Lutheran denominations said, well, we have this theology of two kingdoms, and that's really a kingdom of the left-hand issue. That's not our business. We don't like it necessarily, but we're not going to, And so there are some Lutheran theologians that we read very frequently, that I had to read, that one of the best Lutheran minds that we have, Ehlert, was someone who was a professor at Munich and didn't do that because he would have lost his position had he done that. So he didn't. He wrote personal letters that he didn't really like all this, but he went along as much as he had to. And the same with Althaus, who was a very famous Lutheran ethicist and so forth. The Confessing Church didn't do that. And many of them would be censored. Bonhoeffer was eventually censored, that he couldn't publish and so forth, regardless of the conspiracy. That was separate. That was just criminal activity. I mean, it was so he was part of this group called the Confessing Church. Lutheran denomination in Germany is wild because they're just with 28 as the standard, and that doesn't. And then there's also independent churches that are not state churches, like there's one today called the Zelk that's relatively large, SELK, which is an independent free church is what they would be called, meaning they weren't funded by the government, which means they didn't have to follow anything. They did whatever they wanted. So anyways, that's what the Confessing Church was. What else do you know about Dietrich Bonhoeffer?
We taught seminary,
Okay.
Union Theological Seminary in New York, and was very impressed with the church in Harlem.
Yeah.
And he had the opportunity to stay in the U.S. as the war was brewing, but he decided to go back to Germany.
Yeah. So.
And so I mean,
Yeah.
he could have just sat it out.
Yeah. So he came to America on it was sort of research, sort of teaching. He already finished he actually did 2 doctorates, and he finished them both. And then he came to New York in 1929, 1930, and was here for a year at Union, and had a very negative experience of most church culture in America, except for black churches that he absolutely loved and got very involved with and so forth. And then went back to Germany. It was just a 1-year thing. And then in early 1940, Reinhold Niebuhr, who was there, created a kind of, honestly, they didn't have anything for him to do, but they created a position for him, and he was able to come, and he would have avoided, and the reason for that at that time was for him to avoid getting drafted. And so then he came there, and he stayed for only a month. He just said, I can't do this. Like my family, my country are suffering, and what am I doing? And so forth. So he went back, but they had it set up. They created a position for him. So that's what you're talking about, Todd. Where he could have stayed in America throughout the entire duration, probably, on a whatever visa that would have been, that teaching fellowship or something like that. Yeah, go ahead, Dan. Yeah.
Over there's a very thick biography of Bonhoeffer. Long ago I bought and meant to read. You know how that goes. Never got around to it. I just want to ask you, at an appropriate point, couldn't I tell a pertinent, related story that's about 3 minutes worth, not necessarily today?
Oh, okay. We'll find a way. But it was, the biography is probably Ebkhard Betke's biography, very famous one.
I don't remember.
Yeah, it's the real, that was first written in the 70s. He was his best friend, Ebkhard Betke, yeah. And his biography is the standard for Bonhoeffer's life. It's like 1,100 pages or something. And it is,
Not book club.
yeah, it is detailed. I mean, including and it's amazing for a resource to find out about him. Like, we know what books he was reading at different times. So for those of you who know the thing that was published called the Letters and Papers from Prison, most of those letters were written to Ebkhard Betke. because he saved his, and so yeah, that's why it got so much. And then Betke died, I want to say about 10 years ago, and then there was this flurry of other biographies that came out that must have been held in the wings out of kind of respect for Betke. Yeah, so.
Yeah. Also, Princeton University Press publishes a series called Religious Monuments of the World. One of them is volumes devoted to letters and papers from Princeton.
Interesting, yeah.
And we had the Cairo speaker.
It was 2021, I think. Yeah.
Rachel's dad.
Yeah, Mark Brocker was here. And he talked about Bonhoeffer, specifically Bonhoeffer's ethics. And I will tell you that much of what we're going to do is based on a syllabus of a class or a seminar that he leads from, and this is the 2023 was the, what was the title? Who is Jesus Christ for us today? And so we won't do the whole thing, that was many sessions, but that's where I'm drawing a lot of what we're going to be doing together as a group. So we know some things about Bonhoeffer. We could talk more about his biography, but I want to just make mention of, oh, you can't really see it here. There's a thing, it should say Bonhoeffer coming 2024. Anyone seen this? No. It's out. Yeah. This is a new film.
Title is
I believe it's just Bonhoeffer, but it got cut off there in the thing. I've not seen it. It's in, I think, theaters now, and probably knowing, it's Angel Studio, which is the same group that put out the Chosen, yeah. And so the reviews of it, I have to say, are well made, but maybe not so much Bonhoeffer. Meaning it's the Bonhoeffer family has spoken very negatively about it, the International Bonhoeffer Society. I don't want to talk about this. I haven't even seen it, but because it's built all on this idea of him having this incredible moral clarity his whole life and so forth. If you read carefully Bonhoeffer, it's the opposite, right? He almost didn't believe in moral clarity like that. So that was part of why we were going to do this, is this film is out and so forth. But then we discovered the film wasn't what we were hoping it all would be. And so instead, I'd like to talk a little more, but I will say, for Bonhoeffer, some odd things happen. This is the picture of Bonhoeffer that I think is more accurate. This is an icon made by a modern iconographer. But there's something called the Bonhoeffer phenomenon. And you could put a number of people in this category of anything Bonhoeffer wrote, even on a napkin, has been published. And it often has been seen as significant and important. And it must be right because he died trying to fight the Nazis. And not all of his work was brilliant, but because, Bonhoeffer's works is 16 volumes, and I guess they're putting a new supplement out now. There was some new things released. About 1/5 of it was things he actually published. Everything else are letters and papers. And, C.S. Lewis has the same thing. Anything that's been written that he wrote or was attributed to maybe he wrote has been published, it has been sold, it has been. And Bonhoeffer has been used as the, here's the correct interpretation. I did years ago a project on the United States flags in Lutheran churches. And he does have a little comment about that. It's like this. And people would say, oh, well, there you go. There's the final proof on the matter. Because he said it. He was about 29 at the time. And it's not bad what he had to say, but it was just, this thing happens. He's not the only person like that. But to give you a few pictures of Bonhoeffer in the public imagination, here's a quote. You may have seen this quote before. Silence in the face of evil is evil itself. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. Anyone heard that? So it's in a few different biographies of Bonhoeffer. No evidence he ever wrote that or said that. In fact, one person, a Bonhoeffer scholar, went, and the first time it's found is in 1997. It was at an exhibit in New York of something about Bonhoeffer, and this was on the top of a pamphlet. It didn't say Bonhoeffer wrote it. It was just at the top of the pamphlet. And so this scholar hypothesizes that was the beginning. And somebody saw that and thought he'd seen it, because it feels like Bonhoeffer, doesn't it? You know, it just fits so beautifully with what it's there. But I'll give you even a more striking one. This shows up, by the way, if you watch, there's a film about Bonhoeffer. These words show up after the end. If your opponent has a conscience, then follow Gandhian nonviolence. But if your enemy has no conscience, like Hitler, then follow Bonhoeffer. Martin Luther King Jr. No, he didn't.
That does not sound like Martin.
No, again, who knows what Martin Luther King Jr. said every moment of his life, but no evidence anywhere that he said that. But it's quoted all over the place. Why? Well, this is what's happened with this Saint Bonhoeffer thing. You know, that he must be the most important lodestar that we're all following here, especially those who care about justice and injustice. And, you know, so no, there's absolutely no evidence that Martin Luther King Jr. knew anything about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. There's a scholar who wrote a really good book, his name's Reggie Williams, called Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, and it was about that year that he spent in Harlem. And he said he looked really hard to see if Martin Luther King Jr. ever had anything. And the closest thing you have is that Martin Luther King Jr. talked about beloved community, and Bonhoeffer, in his book, Life Together, could use phrases almost like that, but they're not. There's no evidence of any. Probably Martin Luther King Jr. didn't know anything about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but we don't know. But anyway, but it's just wild that that quote is out there and used. But it was a film about this, you know. So yeah, exactly. No, yeah, that was. It turns out you can misquote anytime. Yeah. Okay, so his life, most people find, is very inspiring and has been used by many people as this is one of those pictures that we want to follow. And there's a lot of hagiographic things done in good and bad ways. But my question is, we know things about his life. Do you know anything about his theology?
Well, one would have had to have read his books.
Yeah. Well, what I used to teach, I had this class called Religion 401, Faith for Life. And it was kind of, you could fill in whatever you wanted. And when I started, I thought, well, why don't we read Bonhoeffer's Discipleship, the first English translation called The Cost of Discipleship. Some of you have heard of that book. Because all the students who are from Christian backgrounds said they wanted to read it. Like they'd always meant to read it. And they enjoyed it for about 10 pages. And then we had 200 more to go through because it's real theology and it takes work and it's over. I quickly discovered that maybe the way to teach was not to do the thing they said they wanted to get into, but go into something else. So anyway, his theology is very interesting and I think has more resonance today than even the inspiration of his life. Not all of it. I mean, he wrote a lot, you know, but what I want to do with this series is let's delve a little bit into what he was actually teaching and thinking. And I think a lot of it is incredibly pertinent, even though he died 80 years ago. And which granted in theological circles is relatively recent, but it is, so I really hope that this can be a series that's has a lot of relevance and insight. So today what I want to do, briefly with the time we have left, is to look at this letter that he wrote to Eberhard Bethge, who we just mentioned, from prison, April 30th, 1944. They were all arrested in 1943 after the so-called briefcase bomb went off. Okay, he was arrested beforehand. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. He was and he was originally. So it gets complicated. He and most Abwehr agents were arrested before they knew he was part of this whole thing. So he had joined in order to avoid getting drafted. He had joined this organization called the Abwehr, which is kind of like a secret. Like a secret service kind of CIA thing, but it was one of the few institutions that predated the Nazis. And so there was this conflict between them and the Gestapo and all these things. And his part in the conspiracy was mostly internationally to try to ensure that if they were to kill Hitler, that then they could get the Allies to come to a peace so that they could get if the right person was in place. And they had several meetings in London because he was able to get out and do that. And they didn't know that by that time the Allies had said they would accept nothing but an unconditional surrender. But that was their big goal, was to make it so that they could have a livable Germany afterward. But so he's in prison now, and he's writing this. One of the last things he writes, he starts to have, because he is transferred from this prison to other ones where it was unclear if he could write much at all. All the stuff he has here is smuggled out. He was friends with guards and things like that. So he's writing Eberhard Bethge, and he asks several questions. So that we're going to look at this. This is where this phrase comes from. What keeps gnawing me is the question: what is Christianity, or who is Christ actually for us today? And the reason he asks this is this is just the next sentence here in this same paragraph. The age when we could tell people that with our words, meaning who is Christ for us today, whether with theological or with pious words, is past. As is the age of inwardness and conscience, meaning where is Jesus Christ for you today? And that means the age of religion altogether, he's saying, is past. We are approaching a completely religionless age. People as they are now simply cannot be religious anymore. So he's writing this, and I don't believe he's writing this to be defeatist at all. We'll talk about what he means by religion in a second. But he's just saying that the way in which we've used to answer this question isn't going to cut it. We have to answer this now in a new way. Who is Christ for us today? And I'm going to go to the next sentence, because this clarifies, what does he mean by religionless? Does it mean there's no religion? It says, even those who honestly describe themselves as religious aren't really practicing that at all. They presumably mean something quite different by religious. But our entire 1900 years of Christian preaching and theology are built on the religious a priori in human beings. Anyone guess what he's talking about there? Religious a priori? Because it kind of gives us the clue what this is all about. A priori means kind of, you imagine something is essential to humans.
And it's always existed.
Yeah, it's always existed internally. If you think of Kant here with you.
There's evolutionary advantage to it.
Right, yeah, that people are just going to be religious. Yeah. Like it's something that's just part of our DNA. And what he's saying is in 1900 years of Christian preaching and theology are built on that assumption. And you could question that maybe for the 1st or 2nd century, but after that, I think you could pretty much agree with Bonhoeffer on that. That, like, if you look at the Reformation, the question that Luther is facing is, are we going to be devotional in the manner of the Roman Catholic Church, which he found unsatisfactory, or be devotional in the new Reformation Church? The idea of not being devotional at all was not on the radar. We talked about that with our series in following Dennis Lindsay's presentation, where he talked about there is faith and then there is unfaith. And his view of unfaith was radical opposition to faith, or it was a active engagement. And what was not included in his biblical description of faith is just those who were not interested one way or another. It just wasn't part of it. That would be a religious a priori. You're assuming that everybody is going to be religious in the way we would imagine religion to function. Bonhoeffer seeing this in 1944, and this is what he's saying is, so if that's true, and he thinks that's true, I mean, then who is Jesus Christ for us today? What does that mean? And that's what he's going to mean by a religionless age. Interestingly, you might be saying, Charles Taylor, 2007, writes a book called The Secular Age. And this was responding to, it was really popular in the 1960s, especially 60s, 70s, and 80s, talking about secularization theory, this idea that everything was going to become more secular. Turned out not to be true in the sense of what he's going to call, what we always assume secularity was. We talked about this maybe a year ago. We did a class talking about this. Yeah, but everyone assumed this was what secularization would end up with. There's no religiosity, no piety, atheism and agnosticism societally. And their picture was always at least the Western picture of the Soviet Union. I don't know enough about the Soviet Union. I don't know if that's true. But the way people talked about the Soviet Union who didn't live in it was, say, religion being actively opposed, and trying to be basically removed. So that's what people assumed this secularization was going to look like. The second possibility would be, well, it's again, there's no public displays of religion. That is, out in public space, there wouldn't be that. But there would be much personal religion, making religion a matter of personal piety. So that's the second possibility of what secularization could look like. And then Charles Taylor said, but actually, what really shows up the most is that religiosity is a matter of individual choice and not the only way to live societally at all. It's not necessarily negative in society, but it's not also seen as a positive in society. That is, he wants to say, if you were to call it what Bonhoeffer calls the religious a priori, saying there was a world in which the way you fathomed living included some kind of religious community, and then there was a world that's been introduced where it is blatantly obvious that you don't have to do that. And that's what Charles Taylor has said. Number one and number two have not occurred. Number two, maybe a little bit. Number one, not at all. But number three, he said, that's our secular age, is that rather than being a time where we would expect that most people are going to be part of a religious community of some kind. Might not be the same as their parents, but something. And if you're not, you're seen as aberrant. Now, it's everybody knows you don't have to be part of a community like this. Those who go to churches don't know they don't have to be part of a community. It's the conditions of plausibility for non-experience are open to everybody, and that doesn't mean people aren't going to be religious. He says, no, people will be religious, but they are making a choice to be religious, and that there is, in a sense, then, he calls it a buffered self. I myself make my own boundaries. What are the ways I'm going to be religious? Where is that going to fit my life? What parts of my life is it? I'll have that as a personal conviction, but I won't tell anybody about it, so forth. Charles Taylor said, that's the secular age we really live in. And he's speaking as particularly in Europe and America, of just people are welcome to do varied things. And so that's what, he's writing this in 2007. It's a very good book. It's a very long book. It's very worth reading. But here, 1944, Bonhoeffer is facing this same question. We're facing an age where it turns out you certainly can be human and not be religious, because all it takes is to see a critical mass of people doing that and say, I guess you can do that. And so how are we going to deal with that? And the question he's going to address is, has anyone ever seen this phrase before? It's in Latin. Nulla salus extra ecclesiam.
No safety
Yeah.
out of church.
Yeah, no salvation. Yeah, in this case, yeah. Yeah, so no salvation outside of the church. Or to make it a sentence, there is no salvation outside of the church. This question of what is the relationship between salvation and the church, the structure of it. This quotation, anyone ever heard of that? If you've seen the what was it, 2003 Martin Luther film that starred Joseph Fiennes and so they quote this. There's many people who are attributed to having said this, but nobody knows the origin. My favorite on the internet was they had one with Mel Gibson's picture next to it. But that there was this idea that, well, the way that you have a relationship with God is how we've defined it here. And the reason it's part of the Luther movie is, of course, Luther is rejecting this, right? Because he then says, well, if that's true, what do you do with all the Greek Christians who aren't part of your church? That's in the film, some of you might remember. But Bonhoeffer looks at this religionless Christianity thing as saying, well, that's the question. What is the relationship between salvation and church? And so what does he say about it? Is there such a thing as a religionless Christian? If religion is only the garb in which Christianity is clothed, and this garb has looked very different in different ages, then what then is religionless Christianity? Or better said, saying, what then really is Christianity? Right? If we can recognize that the religiosity we're used to is just one way it's expressed, and he was smart enough to know it's not the only way it's ever been expressed, so then what is it? What is it that we're facing? What will this be? This essay is going to ask more questions than answers, by the way. This is an essay letter, that he's writing. And he feels that I'll give you one more. He makes this. Paul, when he was writing, was asking the question of this peritome, which is circumcision. Do you have to be circumcised to be justified by God? That was Paul's question in Romans and Galatians. Do you have to become essentially Jewish in order to be part of the people of God? That was a really resonant question in the first century, and it changed everything with Paul's answer. If you know Paul's letters, you discover very few people agreed with him, aside from his own converts. That is, he had a lot of opposition to that question throughout his career. What Bonhoeffer says is, that was Paul's question. Our question is, well then, I should have put religion, that's incorrect. It should say salvation. What's the relationship between salvation and the church? His question is, can you be of part of the people of God without being Jewish? Paul is going to emphatically say yes. Bonhoeffer would say, and we've all accepted that now. Well, now the same question. Can you have salvation outside of a context like a church? And his answer is going to be, again, yes. But just as emphatically. But he means that not just as, and you discover in the rest of his letters, not just as outside of a church structure, you got to be baptized here, but the way of being Christian. There's a way, you can be, in his view, a religionless Christian. He doesn't use that language otherwise, but a religionless Christian, and be part of a church. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the way we've traditionally been religious, the way we've traditionally done religiosity. All of that's up for grabs now. And he says that's the question that we have to face. What does that look like? What does it mean in a meaningful way? So he's going to suggest a few things, but just a pause here. Thoughts or questions? Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
When I've had this discussion with atheists, and I have, and sometimes it's not comfortable, I've made this statement, and it's just a guess, but I think it's a reasonable one, is that if you took a poll of people of them would agree that they are spiritual, if not religious.
Right.
And that the reason this is so is that there is advantage in this in natural selection. I mean, it tends to promote society. Is this wrong?
Well, I mean, I don't know that that's wrong. I can't, you know. Yeah. I mean, what this was, I said, about a year ago we went through that class, and that was the religious nun group. I think we talked about it a couple of weeks ago, where it said, it's about the Pacific Northwest. So it said, you know, it's not nothing in the spiritual. There's deep spirituality. They called it reverential naturalism, real reverence, really seeing something as greater than here, which is the kind of, on the face of it sounds wild with naturalism, you know, but just that sense of mystery and awe and there being something much larger there. In a different century, you would have found, you know, it's wild how many deep Enlightenment, non-religious people were very comfortable with theosophy, you know, and this idea of relationship with like spirits of people who after they died and so forth. Meaning, what was that about? You know, is this idea, well, there is something here, you know. So the idea of the true non-religious, like nothing religious at all, what we would call it, is relatively rare. It also doesn't look like what we would call any kind of traditional religiosity at all. You know, I mean, a sense of the numinous in front of a waterfall isn't like Lutheran worship on Sunday. You know, and so that component, I think, is a little bit of what he's reflecting, but I think what Bonhoeffer is reflecting is, and what's important for us to be reflecting is not how all those other people think and behave, but what does this mean for us? You know, and I think that's the component. And what, you know, because it's, go ahead, Gary. Yeah.
Well, I think when we think about spirituality and religion and faith, I think those are terms that have overlapping meaning, but also some separate meaning. And I think for people today who say, you know, I don't go to church regularly, but I am spiritual, they are more comfortable saying that they are spiritual.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure they have a good definition of what that means. But
Yeah.
it's a comfortable thing to say to somebody if you want to get into a friendly, polite conversation and not get too antagonistic about God and religion.
Yeah.
So I think it's a bit confusing.
Yeah. No, you know, in a religious studies sense, to say one is, what is it, spiritual but not religious is sort of nonsense. I mean, just because of the way religious studies would define those two terms. But people mean something by it. I mean, it's not nonsense. You know, it's, yeah.
I think in the AA fellowship,
Yeah.
there are plenty of people who don't have anything to do with Christianity. They never want that. They've been wounded by it.
Yeah.
You know, there's the whole spectrum. You know, it's nonsense. You know, all of it. But most of those people would say that they are spiritual people because, you know, what's taught in AA is that alcoholism is a spiritual illness with a spiritual solution.
Yeah.
And so to remain sober, you have to have some sort of belief in a higher power or something beyond yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that I know plenty of people who, when they say they're spiritual but not religious, I know exactly what they mean because of the way they talk and the way they live.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think about my son, who's a nurse, and who, you know, works with life and death all the time. He's not a religious person, but in order to do what he does and to carry on through the vicissitudes of his life, I believe that he has to have some sort of spirituality, or he couldn't do it. You know?
Yeah, and that sense of, the very least, it can't just be about the nucleus of all things, of just where I am. There has to be something bigger. There has to be. So, this is what we're living in, is what Bonhoeffer was talking about. This is, to me, not a question that what Charles Taylor called secularization 3, or what, Bonhoeffer calls, it turns out religion isn't a priori in the way that we would think about it. That, to me, is where we're living. Well, Bonhoeffer's going to, in this letter, only suggest something. But I think it's worth us thinking about, because his question is not necessarily, how are all the people thinking who are not religious? He's asking, so who is Jesus Christ for us? And he's writing to Ebkhard Betke, so 2 pastors, and, and saying, so what does that mean? Where are we going to find Jesus Christ? And so he provides a critique and then an opportunity. He says we need to stop looking for God in the margins. Now, he's going to use the words margin differently than we would. Margins we think of people left out or something like that. That's not what he's talking about. So you can look what he's saying. He's saying religious people speak of God at a point where human knowledge is at an end, or sometimes when they're too lazy to think further, or when human strength fails, either to appear to solve insoluble problems or to provide strength when human powers fail, thus always exploiting human weakness or human limitations. What is he saying? Saying, where is it that people who are traditionally religious look for their religion too frequently? Where we don't understand. So you say, we leave room for God only out of anxiety. And so what he means, therefore, is how are you experiencing God if where you're putting God is where you can't experience it? Meaning, and the big one he's going to have is, I have a quote in a minute, I don't want to jump the gun. Big one he's going to have is, I'll just do it here, but what do we believe the resurrection is for? And his statement, we'll read the rest of it later, but the belief in the resurrection is not the solution to the problem of death. He's not saying that it's not the solution, meaning it is the solution, but if that's all it is, then that's something that has nothing to do with our living experience right now. That's something that will happen later on. And that's what he wants to say. We can't have a religiosity that is just about the margins of our lives. It's got to be at the center of our lives.
This is Bonhoeffer, this is not Charles Taylor, right?
Yeah, this is Bonhoeffer. Okay. Yeah, this is this letter he wrote in 1944. I got me total. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm getting totally too many in a row. Okay, so let's start with the beginning. Here, go ahead, Sally.
I was just confused about the next slide. Go ahead.
This one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What does that have to do with margins?
Well, this idea of the margins of what we can when we don't understand, and when we're afraid, or when we have anxiety over what we can't control. So I think that's what he's talking about there.
So when we're on the margins is when we leave room for God.
When we're at wit's end.
Right.
Yeah.
So that non-margins is.
It's not about people on the margins. Yeah, I don't know how to say that.
No,
Yeah.
I know, but the
Yeah.
non-margins that you have at the top of all of these slides
Yeah.
has to do with this topic and not
Yes.
that quote.
Yes, it's the topic.
Okay.
And so instead he says, how do we push to the center? Right? And so I'd like to speak of God not at the boundaries, but in the center. Not in weakness, but in strength. Thus not in death and guilt, but in human life and goodness. And so this is where we use the word boundaries and margins is totally different. Like one of the things we're trying to do is to say, yeah. But this is what he's trying to say is, and I think he's not saying God isn't there in those marginal experiences. He's just saying, if there's going to be any religiosity today, any Jesus Christ for us today, it's got to be also in what we can do and rather than what we can't. And he's facing 1944, where there is a feeling that we can't do anything. And the way that one of his biggest things in his ethics that he never finished, but it has been published in various iterations, is one of the greatest challenges we have is quietism from despair. Meaning, we don't think we can actually do anything, so we just do nothing at all. And that was when Mark Brocker was here, that's what he talked about, which was that when you face an ethical decision, Bonhoeffer believed you weigh the options and then you take a decision, and it very well could be the wrong one, but you don't know that yet. And then if it was the wrong one, you do something new. So that's for him was how do we say Jesus in our lives today has to be about our lives today, not just about what's that going to mean after death. What's that going to mean on some, and he's very Lutheran, but, language of justification before God sounds like something that's really up to God. And what does that do for how we live and work and be, in our own life? And that's why he jumps to this. And it should say belief. That's my scribal error there. Belief in the resurrection is not the solution to the problem of death. God's beyond is not what is beyond our cognition. Meaning, we don't know what happens after death, so resurrection solves it. He's saying, no, resurrection is about a real life we're living now. God is the beyond in the midst of our lives. The church stands not at the point where human powers fail at the boundaries, but in the center of the village. And he kind of ends the letter there. He doesn't finish this thought. And he says, I'll write more about this. He never writes more about it. Or if he did it, we don't have it anymore. Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
So, with regard to quietism versus activism, some of us are wrestling with this
Yeah.
month.
Yes.
And I have been thinking, gee, maybe I should build up my fortress
Yeah.
a little bit more. Fortress of family and friends and books and music. But maybe that's not right.
Yeah.
Maybe, but I don't know what to do.
Yeah. Bonhoeffer will meet you here. His ethics is interesting. It's one of the most interesting ethics books that I know of. I'm not an ethicist, but I've read a few ethics books, where he is opposed to the idea that you're going to have a morally right answer to any situation. He believes life is too complicated. What you can do is to say, I think I ought to do something today that must be contextual. He's opposed to all idealism because he says that's the thing that gets us in trouble. But, this was when Mark was here. What did he say? The problem with hard decisions is that they're hard. Said, and so this is where, and so I knew Mark before I took a class from him, and he gave us all these ethical scenarios, and we had to come up with a solution to these things. And they were, whatever scenarios they were, and they were always impossible. And the whole point was, so what are you going to do? Because to sit idly wasn't one of the options. And so, so I can't answer that for you, Dan. But but Bonhoeffer would appreciate where you are and saying, that's where everybody is, if we're being honest. And in any situation in life, whenever we're faced with something that's a difficult decision, it is a difficult decision, and what should we do? In his case, this was a big thing. We don't have, because he never talked about the conspiracy, obviously. He didn't tend to put that in writing. But the question about whether he would join the Abwehr, and because he was a really strong pacifist, and then whether he would leave Union Seminary and go back to Germany, he did write about. And he really struggled with those questions. He knew he was going to do something wrong either way. So what are you going to do? You don't have the choice of doing the right thing. He felt it was wrong for him to hide in New York while his nation was suffering, and he was opposed to National Socialism already in 1933. I forget how soon, but very soon if not even the same week, that Hitler was named as Führer. He gave a radio address theologically opposing the concept of Führer. It was cut short, sort of. Meaning everybody wants the drama that it was, the Gestapo was pulling out all the things, something. Well, he was supposed to go for half an hour, and after an hour, it was turned off. So it may have been just long-winded, Professor. But anyway, but he did deal with that. Whatever I'm doing is wrong. If I go there, I'm part of it. If I stay away from it, I'm part of it. And it was that. And he eventually decides he's got to go back. He just has to be back with his people, yeah.
This is the right place, pardon me, to tell my story.
Oh.
There's just enough time.
Yeah, okay, go ahead, yeah.
This gets me very emotional. Okay, summer of 1966, I just graduated from college, University of Chicago, and I was going on a trip to India with something called the Experiment in International Living, where various meetings were arranged for us. But I thought I would take advantage of that. I went down to Chicago sometimes, and I told them I was going to India, and that they would be included in an audience with the Dalai Lama, and give me some press credentials so that I have an opportunity, rather than just an hour audience with them, I could follow them around for 5 days. And I did. And okay, it was very interesting, but silly me, I wanted the answer to a question, and I knew it was an impertinent question, and I knew I had to save it for last, if at all. And okay, at that time, he understood English, but he had to talk through an interpreter. He was 33, I was 22. This impertinent question was this, and it's an obvious one. If time travel were possible and you had the opportunity to kill Hitler, would you do it? I thought he said, what a ridiculous question. This has no basis whatever in reality. That's what I expected to hear. He said, kill him, but do it out of compassion for his victims and even for the man himself. I still think of that. It just makes me misty. Evidently, someone else asked him the question fairly recently, sometime in the last 10 years, and he got a lot of flack for it.
For that same answer.
For the same
Yeah.
answer.
Yeah, interesting. Oh, thanks for sharing that. Yeah. I mean, this is what Bonhoeffer was facing. He was a very, very ardent pacifist, and he essentially joins the military. I mean, it was the Abwehr was confusing, and what he was doing, it avoided him being on the holding a rifle. But that's what he was doing. I mean, he was part of the war. He really struggled with that question.
Well, it was military intelligence, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it was. And it was confusing. I mean, like, it was this subgroup, and he got involved with it, could do it as his brother-in-law, who had already been involved, so forth. And then later they get involved in the conspiracy. However, it is somewhat unclear how much Bonhoeffer was actually involved in the conspiracy. A little, at least. Like, for example, whether he even knew about what the assassination attempts were, or so, but, his role was small. But in
Well, to go back to
Yeah.
Dan's dilemma of,
Yeah.
what do we do, in 2 weeks?
yeah,
The confounding thing, and I think this was true in Nazi Germany, is that to find out if there was a possible path of resistance was so obscured. I mean, our news media is so controlled, and it's going to be even more that way. There's just a helplessness that I feel about, what resistance would even look like.
yeah. Well, and that's where
And
the
that's, whether or not
Right.
it would decide to participate in it.
Right. No, and and those are the things that he would say is, that's where these things are hard, because you're not gonna know. So what are you going to do with your not knowing? I mean, and then that's part of the challenge. And he also said in a totally different context, he said, how do you participate? And that's what Brocker's thing was about. When is this a moment of the extraordinary, and when is it the ordinary? And he got all into politics in his talk, which got a lot of eyebrows raised at the least. But because Bonhoeffer did believe that when you can use regular methods of doing things, you use the regular methods. That he said sometimes you do have to grab the wheel yourself, but there's spaces where you can. And then he said, he changes the metaphor because that's like driving a car. And then he said, and sometimes you do have to put a spoke in the wheel, which seems to be the wheel on the road. But anyway, he mixes his metaphor. But cycling perhaps, yeah. Yeah. And so, but he saw that as a rare situation. He felt he was in that. I mean, with National Socialism. But he was always a fan of,
He was in a position to know things. I mean,
Yeah.
he knew the people who were talking about a plot to overthrow Hitler.
No,
Not all of us are going to know.
No, well, and one thing that Bonhoeffer, of course, was a very affluent family who had a lot of resources, and as a result, were able to nuance a lot of these things, and were able to have more leeway. And like, how did he get to go to London? Just because he was part of the Abwehr wasn't going to do that, but he had a lot of connections, and that was a family societally, thing. But these days it'd be called using your privilege, but which isn't that easy to do either, I mean, I can't provide trite answers, and I don't think Bonhoeffer would either, of saying,
I'll go back on Fred Rogers. Look for the helper.
Yeah.
And try to be one.
Yeah. Last thing ever recorded. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everybody. So next week, we're going to do this for 4 more sessions. That'll take us into the beginning of February, and then Vicar Ian is going to lead us in 3 sessions where my job is to sit in the back and not say anything. So.